The Fáilte roimh go léir ar nocht ar son trasna tíre. My name's Conor Dullahan. I'm a collector, author, and I run a Facebook page called Early Irish Militaria. I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's talk and speaker. But before we jump in, here's a snapshot just of the lineup for the rest of this week. So tomorrow night we've got The Forgotten Order, The Orange Order in Ireland by Quincy Duggan. Wednesday we've got The Limerick Soviet, A Forgotten Revolution of 1919 by Liam Cahill. Then on Thursday, Marianne Maher is going to talk to us about the World War I ex-servicemen cottages in Callan, and then a complimentary talk by Nigel Henderson then on Friday evening, ex-servicemen cottages of Northern Ireland. So Liam and the other organisers did want me to mention that for the months of July and August, we'll be doing Wednesday evenings only. So unless something particular prompts us to action, but just for the months of July and August, the summer months with holidays and everything else, we're going to go to Wednesday evenings only. So back to tonight, delighted to be joined by Ailbhe Ruairí. In her own words, she hopes tonight's talk complements Síobhra Aiken's previous talk by delving a little deeper into the military service pension records, that collection, and some of the applicants themselves. Ailbhe is a PhD student in Maynooth, almost finished, thank God, and I'm sure she'll be relieved, but hopefully fairly soon. And her research centres around the experiences of women in County Louth, which happens to be my home county, during the revolutionary period, 1900 to 1924. So, Ailbhe, you're very, very welcome.
Thanks very much, Conor, and thanks very much to Liam and Marcus, everybody from Trasna na Tíre for having me here today. So I'm primarily going to be talking about the military service pensions collection today and how it relates to women. So I suppose the layout of the talk, first of all, I'm going to be talking about the collection in general, a little bit of information on that. I'm going to be looking at some of the weaknesses of the collection from a historian's point of view. Then I'm going to be looking at the application criteria for women applicants. And then lastly, I'll be going into a few examples of specific pensions, some from more well-known veterans of the Irish Revolution, from more famous women, more well-known women, and then some from, I suppose, the lesser known women. So first of all, the military service pensions collection, it's held in the military archives in Cailbhe Barracks and Rathmines. Basically what they are is pensions that veterans of the Irish Revolution, men and women who fought during the War of Independence and Civil War, they could apply for these pensions in recognition and in compensation for their sacrifices for their country. What do they contain? It's an absolute massive collection, huge. One person alone could only scratch the surface. They contain actual application forms from these men and women, references, because you had to get other people to confirm and verify that you did everything that you say you're saying that you did. There's interviews, because people were called by the Military Service Pensions Board to attend interviews about their activities. You've doctor's notes, social welfare, means tests, medical reports, Garda reports, payment certificates, death certificates, massive amount of correspondence, letters, complaints. You also have appeals, typed summaries of people's activities, and then you also have interdepartmental memos and internal memos as well. So just to give a little bit of a background to the introduction of the pensions, why were they brought in? In 1923, Liam Cosgrave and the Cumann government introduced them to the army, to the National Army. At the time, there were 52,000 soldiers in the Free State Army in 1923, and there was a massive demobilisation project where they were trying to reduce the army to peacekeeping level around 1,300. So in order to try and appease the army, to try and ensure loyalty, they decided to open up the idea of army pensions. In 1924, there you'll see in red, that was when the pensions were first introduced. Now they were only open to members of pro-treaty organisations, so pre-truce Irish volunteers, Irish Citizen Army, Fianna Éireann, members of the Hibernian Rifles, Free State Forces, and members of the CID. Women technically could not qualify because Cumann was an anti-treaty organisation, so that's very important to say from the outset. So 1924 Act, it's only pro-treaty organisations. Then when we move on to 1932, when Fianna Fáil come into power under Eamon de Valera, and Frank Aiken was the Minister for Defence at that stage, pensions were very much a contentious issue. They were almost used as for securing votes for anti-treaty voters in general elections. The pensions were one of Fianna Fáil's mandates. Vote for us, we'll get anti-treaty organisations their pensions. So when Fianna Fáil came into power, 1934, they widened the scope to include anti-treaty veterans and organisations. The rest of the years there on the timeline are really just amendments, just sort of extending closing dates for applications, broadening eligibility and criteria, trying to include the widows and children of pension applicants, survivors' medals, that type of thing. So it's a very, very it's a huge collection, huge time lapse. The collection was closed to the public until 2008. Until then, it was decided to release the files to members of the public. A digitisation project was started by the Military Archives in 2008, which is ongoing in Ailbhe Barracks. Pensions are being released on a staggered basis. They're being digitised and released online in PDF format. Since 2008, there have been 8 releases so far. And until everything is released online, the hard copies, unfortunately, are not available to the public, which I understand, I completely understand, but it makes it difficult for historians and students of history like me to kind of get the full picture of what's going on. So a lot of my results would be inconclusive because I'm only working with what I have, what's been released so far. There's also a lot of data protection closure orders on some of the files that mention people who are still alive. One of the main questions, I suppose, that needs to be answered is, why did veterans apply? Why did people apply for these pensions? It started off as an appeasement for members of the National Army, but as it progressed, the pensions, people applied for them. For one reason was recognition of their sacrifices, their activities, that they were involved in the actual struggle. Another reason was economic necessity. I think, especially in 1920s, 1930s Ireland, huge poverty, huge emigration as well. There was also, a considerable amount of people who didn't apply for the pensions, and they're also quite interesting, that cohort. A lot of anti-treaty people didn't apply. In fact, the IRA and Cumann banned their members from applying for the pension. There would have been a lot of bitterness, I think, a lot of pride as well. People who are very staunchly anti-treaty. You can imagine people's thinking, you know, why would I look for compensation from a government that I've been fighting against for however many years? So that's just a little bit to the background of the pensions themselves. This is just a little, I suppose, some stats on what's been done so far and what the amount of information you're actually dealing with and trying to collate. So by 1957, 82,000 veterans applied for military service pensions. Huge amount. And when they first started, when the military service board and the Department of Defence first started actually trying to sift through all of this, they only had about 5 people working on it, and they were at first required to work in a group of 5 on each single person's application, which would have taken something like 80 years. So eventually they decided to work in 2s, but it still took an awful long time to make a dent in that amount of people. And unsurprisingly, there was a lot of complaint, questions being raised in the Dáil about why is it taking so long for decisions to be made on people's applications. Quite a stark statistic there. Only 19% of veterans were actually successful in their military service pensions. And as I think as we go on, it will become more obvious as to why only 19% were actually successful. So at the time of writing, June 2020, 9,555 pensions have been digitised and released online. So there's still quite a bit to go, 82,000. And of that 9,000 or so, 1,773 are from female applicants, and that's the website there that you can access everything. You can, there's a search engine, you can put in people's names, you can search by gender, by county, by country, you can search by reference number, by subject information. You could literally go down a rabbit hole. It's hours and hours of interesting material. So this is kind of the makeup of the Military Service Pensions Board, if you like. At the very bottom of the scale, you had the, well actually we'll start from the top. So from the very top, you had the Minister for Defence. The Minister for Defence could have an application re-examined. If he wanted, he could also have a decision overturned. Next, then you had the referee. The referee was usually a judge or a barrister with 10 years standing. They had the power to call people to interview and question them under oath in some cases. The advisory committee, there were 4 members altogether. It was usually a mix of pro-treaty and anti-treaty. They were mostly civil servants, and as I said, they worked in 2s on each person's application. Then you had the verifying officers. So the verifying officers were usually prominent local men and women who could be called upon by the advisory committee to give evidence and testify for an applicant. And the government and the Military Service Pensions Board really very much relied on their memory, their verbal assurance, their honesty. So the job of the verifying officers was to say, oh yes, Jimmy Bloggs was in the IRA, or no, he wasn't. So the verifying officers had a huge amount of power. An awful lot rested on them. This is just here to show there were actually different types of military service pensions. So the first one there, you had just an ordinary military service pension where you were claiming for your military activities during the War of Independence, during the Civil War. Then you had the military service medal, which was it was a little bit easier to get. With the military service pension, it was quite a thorough investigation. You had to fill out an application form that was 19 pages long. You had to submit references alongside it. You were called for interview in Dublin. So there were quite a number of hoops to jump through. With the military service medal, it was a little bit easier to get because all you had to do was fill out an application form and have a number of verifying officers confirm your details. And you'll often find that many more people applied for the medal as opposed to the pension. A lot more people were more interested in the recognition aspect as opposed to the compensation. You know, the medal could be worn at parades, at events, and it was easier to get. Then you also had a wound or an illness pension. If you were injured on active service during the War of Independence or Civil War, you could apply for that. That was run or operated very much on the same level as British soldiers' disablement. You had to attend a medical examination with an appointed doctor by the Military Service Pensions Board, and you were given a percentage. If you were over 80%, you would have qualified. Special allowance or a disability pension. Again, that was something else that you could apply for if you were over 70, if you could prove that your disablement was over a certain amount, and then lastly, the widows and dependents allowance. So if you could prove that you were either partially or fully dependent on a brother or a husband or a father that was killed in action, you could get a pension from that. So I'm going to be examining different types of these pensions. It should be said as well that the military service pension, the actual law and the acts behind it can be quite heavy going. So it does take a while to kind of get the hang of the actual the language but behind the military service pensions collection itself. So when the Military Service Pensions Board first eventually decided to include Cumann in the 1934 Act, what they first had to do was construct a comprehensive definition for the term active service, because active service could mean something different for a man, it could mean something different for a woman. So they had to provide a detailed report of the type of activities that would fulfill the requirements of granting a pension. Many of the board members were ex-IRA veterans themselves, and you know, they were understandably unaware of the inner workings and the hierarchical nature of Cumann as an organisation, because Cumann and the IRA, while they were both Republican organisations, they were run very, very differently. So to aid them in their research, the Military Service Pensions Board undertook a series of meetings and interviews with members of Old Cumann in the 1930s to try and better understand the organisation's responsibilities and structure. John McCoy, who was originally from mBan in South Armagh, he was adjutant of the 4th Northern Division IRA during the Civil War under Frank Aiken. So he would have been based around the North Louth, South Armagh and South Down area. John McCoy, he was actually a member of the Military Service Pensions Board from 1934 to 1947. In a memo, McCoy outlined his conclusions on Cumann's qualifying service. So he remained convinced that, quote, no woman could possibly run the risk to life or have such constant service as a full-time column man. There should be no woman assessed during the Tan War to make her equal to a full-time column man. There has been an exaggerated view taken of the military value of the work done by Cumann. So rather than develop a different grading system for women's activities, the Pensions Board applied the same assessment to both male and female applicants. So basically, successful applicants under the 1934 Army Act were allocated a grade between A and E for pension purposes. All female claimants, no matter how active they were, fell within the lowest and second lowest brackets of grade E and D. So just the actual criteria for female applicants to apply, you had to be a member of Cumann or the Irish Citizen Army. You had to be active in April 1921. Now the nominal roles were created by members of the Old Cumann organisation to try and aid the Military Service Pensions Board in trying to figure out who exactly was a member of Cumann, to try and separate people out, I suppose. The nominal rolls they're also available online. They are basically lists and lists of names of women who were in Cumann. Now, there's a lot of problems with these nominal rolls. They're in no way definitive. They are comprehensive to a certain degree, but there's a lot of gaps missing. There's branches missing. They're very much incomplete. And the problem was that the Military Service Pensions Board, when these membership rolls were completed, the board very much treated them as the gospel word on who was in Cumann and who wasn't. So if your name wasn't on the nominal roll, you had a very difficult task ahead to prove to the board that you were involved. Now, there were all types of different reasons why people were left out, why branches weren't included. There's also issues with, you know, the membership rolls don't differentiate between branches that came and went during the period and those branches that were continually active the whole way through the Irish Revolutionary era. It's also, you know, you do have to be sort of cynical to a certain degree. It's also possible that the compilers were more likely to make the lists as long as possible, as within the boundaries of truth would allow. People were almost certainly left out for all types of reasons, you know, women moving away from an area due to emigration, or marrying outside of a local area. These lists are being compiled in the 1930s, you know, so it's 15, 20 years sometimes after the events have actually occurred. So there are limitations on human memory. You also have to take into account Civil War divisions, you know, are pro-treaty women specifically being left out of these branch roles. So there's a lot of, I suppose, things that you have to take into account when you're going through these roles. So like, for example, with County Louth, which is what I'm looking at, there are only 2 branches in County Louth that are given in the membership rolls, which wasn't true. There were nearly 14 branches of Cumann operating in the county during the War of Independence, but for some reason branches didn't submit rolls. So it's that I wouldn't take the membership rolls as gospel truth by any means. Yeah, so members of Cumann had to provide solid evidence of engagement in military activities. Now, military activities is very vague. What do we mean by military activities? We know what military activities mean in a masculine sense, in a male sense, but for women, it's a little bit open. So the pensions board were provided with a copy of the Cumann constitution, from which they concluded that, quote, very few of the activities which it mentions as appropriate to Cumann have anything to do with what could reasonably be regarded as military service. The emphasis, in fact, is heavily on the political, cultural, and educational side. So what the board did was they characterized Cumann activities into qualifying and non-qualifying categories. So activities like transportation of arms, acquisition of intelligence, administering first aid, official organising work, and being present in one of the Dublin garrisons during the Easter Rising, they were all considered to be qualifying activities for female pension applicants. But women who based their applications solely upon what the board termed to be, quote, usual activities or non-military activities were more likely to be rejected. So these types of non-qualifying activities included fundraising, attending meetings, organising social events, caring for men on the run, doing laundry, looking after political prisoners in the local jail. That was all considered to be non-qualifying, which pretty much cut out 3/4 of the female applicants that were sending in their forms. Over time, the pensions board, they eventually came to add dispatch carrying and safeguarding of arms to the list. But the deputation from Old Cumann, they also attempted to explain the hierarchy of the organisation. As I mentioned, was really different from the IRA. The smallest unit of Cumann was called a squad, or a section, which had about 10 members and was probably more prolific in remote rural areas. A Cumann branch contained 10 or more members and corresponded to an IRA company. I know we're getting a little bit technical here, but bear with me. And lastly, you had a Cumann district council, which was a collection of 3 or more branches and was sort of akin to the size of an IRA battalion. Now, the organisation did not have anywhere near the same membership numbers as the IRA and therefore did not really see the need to form brigades or divisions like the IRA. The Military Service Pensions Board also struggled greatly in discovering the title of the officer who assumed charge in Cumann, because in some areas it was the president, in other areas it was a secretary, whereas with the IRA they had different titles completely. They would have used commandant, adjutant, quartermaster. So it was very difficult to try and equate what pension the president of a Cumann branch should get. How do we work? How do they work backwards? There were a lot of problems with filling out the application form itself. Male and female veterans faced an uphill struggle. The form, as I said, was 19 pages long. Applicants were required to chronologically list the particulars of their activities for 8 years. Between 1916 and 1923. However, the form only provided 3 blank lines per section for the applicants to do that, which wasn't nearly enough space. Some applicants went into huge detail by making their handwriting very small and attempted to squeeze as many words as possible into the margins. Others put very little effort in by leaving sections blank, copying out the same answers for several periods and sometimes shortening their answers to see above. Several preferred to fill in very little information on the form and instead submit a written statement at the end of all their activities, and that seemed to work a bit better. In 1936, the Pensions Board pointed out that the Old Cumann executive is that female veterans in particular were being way too vague in their applications, which was affecting the outcome of the pension. It was hinging on the success or not. So women often, you'll find, they use phrases, things like, I carried out all orders that were given to me, or helping the volunteers in every manner possible. So the statements were too vague, and the Military Service Pensions Board were looking for more information. Often you'll find as well with women in particular that if a woman's claim was turned down by the Pensions Board, the rebuttal or the appeal often contained much more information of their activities in comparison to the first application that they made. There's several possible reasons, I suppose, for women not setting out their activities in explicit detail. Some applicants often relied upon their local TD. They assumed, oh, my local TD is in the Dáil, he'll make representations on my behalf. And you do often find that in Louth, the Louth area, for example, because you had Frank Aiken was Minister for Defence, Peter Hughes, also from Dundalk, was Minister for Defence at one stage. Yeah, you would have had people saying, my Minister for Defence is from South Armagh, from Louth. He's familiar with the service that I rendered during the period. I won't need to put as much information in the form because he'll make representations on my behalf. Memory was also an issue, you know, people finding it difficult to remember the significant details and the dates. Ambushes, events, everything would have blurred together. I think another something else that needs to be brought to the fore, to attention, is the everyday woman who applied for a military service pension in the 1930s more than likely left formal education in her teens, during her teenage years, and entered the workforce soon afterwards. So many of these women didn't get a second level education, let alone a third level education, and were probably unfamiliar with government administration, bureaucratic practices, and didn't have the experience of filling in forms, making a case for themselves, or building an appeal. So in a lot of cases, women who were turned down, they just left it there. They didn't go back and try and appeal their case. It could also be said that many veterans developed false expectations and figured that once they submitted their application, they would be granted the pension straight away without any question. Many people did not anticipate the length they would have to go to actually prove their involvement. Some veterans as well had to contend with neurological conditions developed later in life, which left them unable to write in application forms, and a lot of them would have relied on their children or neighbours to fill out forms. I think historians should also consider the possibility that veterans who were members of Old Cumann or Old IRA organisations, social groups, that they clubbed together and filled in their forms at the same time and sent them off in bulk. There may have also been a certain hesitance and distrust among veterans to voice their true activities to the Free State government, especially if they were on the anti-treaty side. Yeah, I mentioned all this already. So yeah, I mentioned about grade D and grade E. Women who gained grade D, you had to be a member of Cumann Executive, which was the HQ. You were either a paid Cumann organiser, president or secretary in charge of 100 members or more. And then grade E was all ordinary non-ranking members. So I'm going to go into a little bit about some examples of women, so you can kind of get an idea of the timeline of correspondence, and I suppose the nature of the nature of disappointment and rejection as well. So we're first going to talk about Margaret Skinner. Born in Scotland to Irish parents, member of the Irish Citizen Army. She joined the St. Stephen's Green garrison under Michael Mallon in 1916, where she operated as a scout, dispatch rider. Then eventually, when the garrison was forced to move to the College of Surgeons, Margaret Skinner took on the role of sniper. Then, while attempting to burn down buildings on Harcourt Street to cut off the British advance into the city, she was shot 3 times on the Thursday of Easter week. She was shot in the upper right arm and in the back as well, quite close to the spine. She was carried back to the College of Surgeons. She received first aid from Madeleine French-Mullen, one of her colleagues. And after the surrender order, she was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital, where she received treatment for 6 weeks. So her application journey, I suppose, starts in 1925. She sent in her application for a wound pension. She wrote then the following month. She hadn't heard anything back from the Military Service Pensions Board, so she wrote to them again. The board got back to her and basically said, "Don't call us, we'll call you. The matter is still under investigation." So then the Army Finance Officer, so the Military Service Pensions Board operated in conjunction with the Department of Finance. It was a Department of Finance and a Department of Defence venture. So the Army Finance Officer wrote to the Treasury Solicitor for clarification. He said, quote, "The definition of wound in the Act only contemplates the masculine gender. It would be illogical to include the female sex under the term wounded members." In March then, the solicitor writes back to the Army Finance Officer. He says, quote, "I am satisfied that the Army Pensions Act is only applicable to soldiers generally understood in the masculine sense." So the Military Service Pensions Board write back to Skinner and tell her that her application doesn't fulfill the criteria. She's very disappointed, as you can imagine. She feels very dejected. She requests to know under what provision they decided that her case was admissible. The Military Service Pension Board write back and tell her that the wound pension is only applicable to soldiers, as understood in the masculine sense. And then there's a short break for 2 years until 1927. Skinner writes to the board that even though she's a woman, she was a member of the IRA when wounded. The Military Service Pension Board dismiss her letter. They literally just reply by saying, "See our previous communication from 1925." Then we have another gap of a few years. In 1934, Skinner, she decides to go a different route and apply for a military service pension for her military activities between 1916 to 1923. Then in 1937, the legislation for a wound pension is passed and the criteria was widened. So Skinner decides to try again for the wound pension, and she sends in a new application form. The following year, in 1938, she's asked to provide names of veterans who can corroborate her statement. She sends in a list of names, and her references include Dr. Kathleen Lynn, Nora Connolly O'Brien, who would be James Connolly's son. In February, the Military Service Pensions Board take up her case, and they write to the Sisters of Charity in St. Vincent's Hospital requesting evidence of Skinner's committal in the hospital. And they also write to the doctor who treated her, and ask him to provide a statement. So remember, they're writing to these people in 1938 about something that happened in 1916. So there's a huge gap in time. And then eventually in 1938, Skinner she's granted a military service pension for her military activities, and she's granted a grade D, which is the highest grade that a woman can get. That's £80 a year she gets. Later on that year, in May, she's called for a medical examination for her wound pension. So in the examination report by the doctor, he says that she has difficulties in raising her right arm above chest level, and she has chronic pain in her right shoulder muscles. She's awarded 20% disablement for 2 years, pending another re-examination in 2 years. So in 1940 then, she undergoes another medical examination. This time she is awarded her wound pension for life from 1940 until her death in 1971. She gets £30 from her wound pension. So altogether, from the two pensions, from the military service pension and the wound pension, she gets £110 a year. But you can see the time it's taken for her to get that from when she first applies in 1925 up to 1940. So our next example is Bridget Lyons Thornton. So this lady, she came from a Republican family in Longford. Her uncles were Joe and Frank McGuinness. Joe was elected TD in the South Longford by-election while imprisoned in Britain. Bridget Lyons Thornton, she joined Cumann in Dublin in 1915, and she fought in the Four Courts garrison during the Rising. She was also arrested and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail in the aftermath. During the War of Independence, she carries arms and dispatches, administers first aid. During the Civil War, she qualifies as a doctor, and she actually joins the National Army, initially in a civilian capacity to look after the medical needs of female anti-treaty prisoners, but then she was later promoted to the rank of lieutenant in the Army Medical Services. So she's given an army rank. She's eventually demobilized in 1924 during the huge demobilization scheme undertaken by the National Army. So in April 1925, she sends in an application for a military service pension under the 1924 Act. Now this is different. Most of the women who applied for pensions did so under the 1934 Act because they were members of Cumann, and it was only in 1934 that Cumann, as an anti-treaty organisation, would have been eligible to apply. So this is interesting that she's a woman and she's applying for a pension under the pro-treaty 1924 Act. At the time of her application, she was actually a patient in Switzerland, in Leysin. Sorry, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. Leysin. She was receiving medical treatment for TB, and Leysin was kind of a mountain retreat resort in the Alps. And it was there was a doctor named Dr. Augustus Rollier who sort of pioneered new treatments for TB at the time. So he was very much interested in sunlight therapy and high altitude, fresh air, sunbathing. That would cure men and women who were diagnosed with TB. So that's where she was in 1925 when she sent in her application. A few months later, she doesn't hear anything back from the Military Service Pensions Board, so she writes asking the board to please reply to me and if there's any hope of her case being considered. Several high-ranking National Army officials testified on her behalf, including Paudie O'Keefe, Sean McGowan, and Diarmuid O'Hegarty. In 1926, Bridget Lyons Thornton moves back to Dublin, and she writes to the Military Service Pensions Board asking about her claim, if anything has been done. She receives a reply the following month, an invitation from Gearóid O'Sullivan inviting her to attend an interview in Portobello Barracks. Later that month, she was informed unofficially that she was successful and would be awarded a pension. Then there followed, you only see this in the internal correspondence, there followed a heated debate over officials in the Military Service Pensions Board over whether or not she should be permitted to avail of a pension under this particular act. The Army Finance Officer felt that Bridget Lyons Thornton should not be eligible because of the same conditions as Margaret Skinner, that that it's very much a masculine. The act is for men only. However, he was actually overruled by the Minister of Defence, and Bridget Lyons Thornton was awarded a Grade C pension of £123 per annum. So she's actually the only woman to receive a pension under the 1924 Act as a member of the National Army, and not as Cumann. So she's under an army standard, she gets a pension. So I'm just going to finish up with two more examples from my own native County Louth, and I'm going to talk about this one first because this is to do with the Connacht Rangers dependence allowance, and this month is the 100th anniversary of the Connacht Rangers mutiny in India in June 1920, and it has a little bit of a link to Louth here. So these two ladies, Annie and Maggie Smith, they were from Drogheda, County Louth. They were members of Drogheda Cumann, and their brother Patrick joined the British Army during the First World War, which is extremely unusual for the same family to produce two sisters who joined Cumann and a brother who joined the British Army. But in June 1920, their brother was actually shot dead during the Connacht Mutiny. Just for maybe anyone who isn't familiar with the Connacht Mutiny as to what happened, so several members of the 1st Battalion Connacht Rangers were stationed in India in two places named Solon and Yalandhar. They refused to follow orders and mutinied against their superiors. The troops in Solon handed over their weapons initially to the authorities, but then decided to retrieve them from the magazine fort on site. Patrick Smith and another man named Peter Sears were both shot by the guards, who panicked when they saw the mutineers converging on them. Historians have attributed the mutiny to various different factors. British atrocities in Ireland is one. Soldiers receiving letters from home telling them about hunger strikes, about burnings, about raids, about women having their hair cut, executions. That possibly was one of the motivations that affected the mutiny. Other reasons are young, undisciplined recruits, unfavourable working conditions in a hot climate, poor accommodation, tensions between officers and men. So there were two Connacht Rangers killed. 70 Rangers were court-martialed. One of them, James Daly, one of the leaders, he was executed by firing squad for his role. The rest were sent to prison in Britain, but they were eventually released under the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Now, the family back home, the Smith family, were very reliant on Patrick's earnings, and Annie eventually, she took on the role of financially supporting their parents. In 1924, the family's poor financial position was brought to the attention of TD Ailbhe Byrne. In 1930, the family were mentioned in Dáil debates. The British government declined to provide the family with a World War I pension or compensation for the loss of their son. In 1934, Annie made an application through her solicitor for a dependence allowance on behalf of her brother. In the same month, she was told that the Connacht Rangers dependence allowance only applied to the widows and children and not their siblings. And unfortunately, the correspondence ends there. But Maggie and Annie, in the 1950s, they both applied for service medals on behalf of their own activities in Drogheda Cumann. They were both successful in that. Drogheda Cumann is very interesting, has a very interesting relationship with the Military Service Pensions Board. Drogheda Cumann were a very social group. Even after the Civil War, they formed an Old Cumann social group in the town. So they would go on trips down the country. They visited Kilmainham Jail when it was being restored in the 1960s. And when the question of medals came around, they all put their application in at the same time. But what's interesting is all the applications were filled out by one woman, by the secretary of the branch. So all that each individual had to do was sign their name at the bottom of the application, which, you know, I suppose creates all sorts of questions around authenticity and whatnot. It's surprising really that the board didn't pick up on that, because it's the same handwriting in every single woman's medal application, but like 27 out of the 29 Drogheda women who applied for medals were successful. Then just the last one here, Annie Maguire. So she has a connection with Dundalk in County Louth. She was originally from Meath, organised Cumann branches in South Down area during World War I, involved in organising branches, training, basically ticked all the boxes in terms of Cumann's military activities. She was fired from her position in Warren Point for her activities. During the Civil War, she arrives in Dundalk and she completely revitalised and reorganised Cumann there. According to her own evidence, she became Divisional Director of Communications for the 4th Northern Division, IRA. Now that's interesting that she gives herself that, well, whether she gives herself that title or whether that title was given to her, because that is an IRA title. It's an IRA position. It's not a Cumann title. Cumann titles are President, Secretary, Treasurer. So that's very much a military title that she has there. So she ran a dispatch centre for messages coming to and from Dublin. So the start of her correspondence timeline there. So it's quite interesting. In December 1939, Maguire sent in an application for a pension to the board. In May 1938, she unexpectedly withdraws her application. She doesn't really give a reason for that. She just decides to withdraw her application. On the 21st of January 1941, she contacted the board to see if it was possible to have her case reopened. Her restaurant business in Dundalk had fallen on hard times during the emergency. On the 27th of January in the files, we find an internal memo from board member John McCoy, which says, quote, "Please call for oral examination as early as possible," end quote. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, John McCoy was in the 4th Northern Division IRA as well under Frank Aiken, and would have known Annie Maguire very, very well. At this moment in time as well, in 1941, Frank Aiken is the Minister for Defence, and he would have been very familiar with Annie Maguire. He would have been a former colleague in the 4th Northern Division. Also, on a personal note, Annie Maguire made Frank Aiken's wedding cake in 1934, so they were close. On the 3rd of February 1941, a verifying officer who was also an ex-colleague of hers called to the house to interview her about her involvement. on the 3rd of March, a month later, she was granted a pension. So you can see how the quick turnaround there from when she first applies on the 21st of January to when she gets the pension a month and a half later on the 3rd of March is absolutely astounding. So I mean, without coming across cynical, it was possible to have your pension pushed through. It was about who you knew, and representations being made on your behalf. What I think what's most interesting about this as well is that she was treated as a member of the IRA, which was very rare. She even though she was in Cumann, she got the pension based upon her title in the IRA. The importance of John McCoy as well to members and veterans of the 4th Northern Division when they're applying for pensions it cannot be overstated enough. Some people had to wait years, like another woman from RD who is also in my research had to wait 15 years for her application, but here you have somebody else who's only a month and a half turnaround. What's interesting as well about John McCoy, he's from a small little area called mBan in South Armagh, which is Frank Aiken also has connections with it, but of the 8 women from mBan who applied for pensions, all of them were successful because of John McCoy watching over them, looking out for applicants coming from North Louth and South Armagh, South Down. But it's not conclusive to say that, because not all of the pensions have been released yet. There's only 8 pensions from mBan been released. So I suppose just to finish up and conclude, the military service pension collection is it's very much a tale of rejection and disappointment. To have 81% of people be rejected is incredible. I think it's also important to mention that having a public representative intervening on your behalf was extremely important and went a long way. The collection as well it also illustrates poverty in post-independent Ireland. The poverty that was experienced by men and women veterans of the Irish Revolution was incredible. I think bureaucracy is also something else that features highly in the collection. The amount of the hoops that veterans had to jump through to actually get a pension, the distance from when you first applied to when you actually were granted the pension. Well, and I think it says a lot of what as well. The military service pensions are very much a product of the time that they were created in the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, and they very much illustrate, I think, the unfair treatment of women of Cumann, what they went through to actually get a pension. So thanks very much for listening to me. I hope you found it interesting, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be absolutely delighted to hear. Thank you.
Well done, Ailbhe. All right, so I do have a few. So Christina just said a big thank you, explained greatly why so many can't locate their relatives with such, a small number of actual scanned in. So you're what, a little over 12% maybe?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
1,000 out of 82,000. So Emmett comes in and says, hi, Ailbhe, currently doing a research project in Cumann in Kilkenny. It's based on 27 submissions from the Kilkenny Brigade. Any advice where to source corroborating evidence to back up some of the statements would be great. As some maintain, women might have exaggerated some of the roles during the interviews. So
yeah, definitely. It's difficult to say who's exaggerating and who's not. I suppose that's why the Military Service Pensions Board relied so much on the verifying officers to verify what people were doing and what they weren't doing. And I think the criteria was so stringent that it made it difficult for people to exaggerate what they were doing at the time. And women wouldn't have been aware that there were qualifying activities and non-qualifying activities. I think they wouldn't have been privy to a lot of the Military Service Pensions Board conversations, internal memos. It's very difficult to say, who's exaggerating and who's not. And I do think that women in particular had a tendency to downplay their own involvement. They're not used to talking about what they did, and even with their children. I've interviewed quite a few sons and daughters, grandchildren, grandnephews and nieces who have said that their parents or their grandparents never spoke about their involvement in these organizations, and that women would, you often hear women saying, oh sure, I didn't do that much, I only carried a few guns here and there, so it's and then the second one, Kilkenny, Cumann, I find newspapers are absolutely amazing. If you can get into the British newspaper archive or the Irish newspaper archive, they are absolutely fascinating. The Bureau of Military History as well isn't fantastic. It doesn't always mention women from provincial areas, but often the men's statements will sometimes mention a fleeting, will give a fleeting nod to women. I find as well graves, sometimes on graves, if you go to the local area, it'll sometimes say on the grave that they were a member of Cumann, and also obituaries. Nearly always in obituaries it will say former member of Cumann. That's where all my cross references come from anyway.
Okay. From Kathleen, do we know if there's any plans to let people into research archives yet in person, or have the papers transferred to the National Archives eventually?
So yeah, the military archives, they're closed at the moment because of lockdown. I haven't heard anything about when they're due to reopen, but the actual pensions themselves, while they're being digitized, are unavailable for public consultation. Unfortunately, I've tried my best to get in and see, because it would be beneficial for me as well to see stuff coming out, but no, unfortunately they've decided to close off public access while the pensions are being digitized. Okay. And by the way, I don't work for the Military Service Pensions or the military archives at all. This is just an interest of mine.
And from Owen down in Wexford, so did many women receive a medal and no pension?
Yeah, definitely. With the military service pension, if you got it, if you were successful, you were automatically sent a medal as well. But you had a lot more women who just applied for the medal on its own. So there is a huge number of women who just applied for the medal on their own, or if they were unsuccessful in their pension application, decided to put in a separate application for the medal instead. So yeah, you do. You have a lot more women applying for the medals as opposed to the pensions.
Okay.
It's easier
And
to
I
get
think
as well.
yeah, this was an observation when you were talking about the Margaret Skinner, certainly in the early days, and I think it was the McCoy comment, all I've got is a whiskey tango foxtrot, if you know what I mean. Okay, let me keep going down. There's loads coming in now from Dominic. Dominic, I'm not sure if you know, but Dominic's an author. He's been on a couple of times, but absolutely brilliant, Ailbhe. Such a good explanation of the place of coming on in the military service pension collection, and in particular why some branches were missing and why some who had given so much were rejected for a pension. It must have been a very bitter blow. Thank you for a very insightful and helpful discussion in understanding the files.
Thank you very much, Dominic.
Yeah. Comment from David that Thornton was also given a good job in the Dublin Corporation, which was under Cumann and Ailbhe party control at the time. Very informative, wonderfully presented, top drawer from Bart. Dominic dovetailed quite quickly when you talked about all the Drogheda women having the secretary fill out all the forms, and they just had to sign. He just said wise women and Louth.
Yeah, I mean, top marks for efficiency there.
Exactly. From Marianne, thanks Ailbhe for a great explanation into the criteria and why pensions were declined. She said, I had a local woman who was appealing her pension from 1934 to 1958, and when she was finally granted a grade E of only £6 in 1958, she died in 1960.
Yeah,
she says, when I look at the file, she really didn't complete the form with the correct information into her involvement in Cumann on, and in particular the RIC barracks attack in Drangan in County Tipperary. So I think that resonates well with what you were saying, you know, either underestimating or not really understanding, you know, what all qualified criteria. So
yeah, and I think as well the you know, it was difficult to find people to testify on your behalf because you did have people were getting on in age. The secretary of your branch might have passed away, so who are you going to ask? You know, a lot of people turned to the IRA in their local area to provide information on what Cumann were doing, but some IRA commanders were getting really annoyed with the Military Service Pensions Board, saying, why are you writing to me about Cumann? I haven't a clue what they were doing. Yeah, death was a big part in the application process. Yeah, slowed things down certainly.
Aisling asked a question, but I think you did answer it by the time. Annie McGuire, what pension grade did she get in the end? Did she get a C?
Yeah, she got a D.
A D.
A D. Okay. Yeah, it was Bridget Lyons Thornton got a C.
Got a C. Okay. From David, great presentation. Roll on the rest of the pension files being released. Mahagat, fantastic. Thanks a mil. Of Síobhra Aiken joined in. Great talk.
Thanks,
great to hear more about the Louth revolutionaries. Looking forward to reading more of your research. She said, and I didn't know Annie made the amazing wedding cake.
Yeah, I actually have a picture of it. And I wonder, could I possibly? Oh no, it's probably too much to share it on the screen here. But it's.
You can take off the screen share and just
okay, cool.
If you want to root around, try and find it.
Yeah. I'll root around while I'm trying to.
I'll read out some more like compliments anyway.
Yeah.
There was a big thank you for the excellent talk. Actually, Christina said she took 3 pages of notes.
Wow.
Aisling says, hi again. I'm new to Trasna and Tira and was late to the talk. Is there a way to get a copy or transcript? And what we'll do there is basically, Aisling, for you, and all the talks go up onto YouTube fairly quickly. So within a day or two, they'll be up there. Patrick Kilfeather, thank you for a most interesting presentation. Oh, a debt of gratitude to all the women for what they did, carrying the dispatches, arms, provisions of food, shelter was so important, and they did so at grave risk to themselves and their family. From Roisin Wheel of Weacus, Ailbhe, enlightening lecture. Niamh Guramila Mahagat, and that was brilliant. And Liam, my own personal history came from my next door neighbour, Marianne Clifford. Why does Ailbhe think women have been so underrepresented, and can this be corrected?
Oh gosh, where do you start with that one? I think it's a lot of it is to do with I think the 1920s, 1930s Ireland. That women were very much left to the side, I think, when it came to acknowledging their role, if you like. I think a lot of women as well were seen to be, tarnished goods as well. Especially when it came to, it's incredible the amount of women who either never marry or become nuns, ex Cumann members. But to be honest, I think it had a lot to do with the Constitution. I think, the 1937, women's places in the home. I think women were very much treated as second-class citizens in the 1930s, in the post-independent period. It's a difficult one to get your head around. I think, though, at the moment, in the last certainly 10, 20 years, ever since I think Margaret Ward's book Unmanageable Revolutionaries came out, I think that it's on its way to being corrected,
right.
And I think since 2016, especially, I think women's involvement has, I think, received high praise and a spotlight as well. I mean, in 2016, I remember thinking, oh my God, it was at one stage I had, like a talk every week almost for nearly 3 months. People were so interested about the role
I got to
that
see
women.
one of them myself. I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Colin mentioned here that the Kerry numbers are reported to be 12% of the national membership. Do you have any idea how accurate that source is? And, sorry, the question is, how accurate is it? His source is the Atlas of the Irish Revolution.
There's a very good book by Cal McCarthy. It's called Cumann and the Irish Revolution, and he attempts to get to grips with the actual strength of Cumann during the period and how accurate it is. I'm not sure what the primary source that the Atlas of the Irish Revolution is using. If it's the membership rolls, then I would say not, more accurate for some counties than others. It just depended on who was living in the area at the time and who was available to put together the membership rolls. Certainly in Louth, anyway, a lot of members married and moved to Dublin. So there was no one there to actually put together the membership rolls and send them into the Military Service Pensions Board. So I reckon that's why Dundalk don't show up in the membership rolls. But I mean, I think,
it's also,
I would imagine Kerry.
Nothing for a wee while too, though.
Oh, sorry.
It's also beat into us to say nothing for a wee while and then say nothing at all.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd imagine in Kerry, Kerry being quite anti-treaty, maybe not, very staunch anti-treaty Republicans not wanting to cooperate with a Free State government issuing pensions. But, later, maybe when Fianna Fáil came in, Kerry veterans might have been more willing to to cooperate in that respect. So it's very difficult to say. I don't think we'll ever know really what the true membership of Cumann was in the period.
Okay. All right. Well, come here. Maybe you'll send that on to Síobhra.
Yeah, here, I have it here. I'll just share. Will I share my screen and just so everybody can see it?
Holy moly. Brilliant.
6 tiers. Amazing.
Wow.
Frank Aiken's wedding cake.
Patriotic as get out.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah.
Class.
Yeah. The detail on it.
And Annie made that.
Annie made that. Yeah, her bakery is still going in Dundalk. The bakery on Jocelyn Street. She ran a restaurant. Yeah, the home bakery. Yeah, there's actually a portrait of her on the wall in there.
Yeah.
And yeah, she ran it was called the Emer Bakery or restaurant. It was a ballroom as well. And yeah, she made that.
That's
amazing.
Amazing. Anyway, great job. All right, we'll leave it there. We'll turn off the recording. Hold on.